I agree that if I play this game and end up in a sex cult, it's my own damn fault.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
Hi, I'm Phil Thomas, and you can consider me a video game newbie.
I'm Andy Hunter, a lifelong video gamer, but mostly just Zelda, Mario, and Pokemon.
I'm Elford Stephens, a longtime video game enthusiast and looking to share video game as a hobby to the next generation.
Today, we're going to talk about a game called Thrill Kill. Has anybody heard of Thrill Kill?
No,
sir.
No, I've never heard of it, but I trust that this episode is going to be a thrill kill a minute.
If you were to hear that a game was called Thrill Kill, what do you think that game might be about?
I think it would probably have to be about murder on a roller coaster.
Ooh, that's a good one. I feel like you're playing from the perspective of a serial killer or something like that.
Might be like when you're in elementary school and they're telling you, you're not going to have recess today. Instead, you're going to go into the library.
Wow.
Also like buzzkill, but even...
So they killed the thrill as well.
Oh.
Elvis left the room.
Took a minute.
My guys, we got a story for today because Thrill Kill was an unreleased 3D fighting game created by a company called Paradox Development for a publisher called Virgin Interactive Entertainment, and this game was intended for the Sony PlayStation. Players took on the role of one of 11 fighters as they fought in violent battles with up to 4 players in one of a series of confined areas. In each fight, players tried to fill up their kill meter by registering hits on their opponents, and successfully filling it allowed the player to execute a thrill kill, murdering their vanquished opponents in a variety of gruesome ways.
So, Kevin, based on one of the previous episodes, I would have to imagine this was somewhat inspired by Mortal Kombat.
Maybe a little bit, yeah. Also, the bulk of the game's roster tried to do this while wearing S&M-themed bondage gear. Oh boy, do I have a story to tell you. With that in mind, we are going to look at Thrill Kill, a game that is quite possibly the horniest, violent game to never see release. We'll look at its fascinating origins in the comic book industry, its strange journey from the sports title to BDSM-themed fighter, its cancellation, and its surprising legacy. Our story begins with Christine Xu. Christine Xu studied accounting in college, earning a bachelor's at Taipei's Ming Chuan College, followed by an MBA at San Jose State University. In the late 80s, Christine earned an executive position at Malibu Graphics, which was an indie comics company founded in 1986 by Dave Olbrich and Tom Mason. Anybody heard of Malibu?
Yeah, I think they published the comic that Men in Black movies were based on, right?
Yeah. The best known title to ever come out of Malibu is Men in Black. The other big thing that they're generally known for is there's this superhero team called Ultra Force. They also briefly served as the publishers for Image Comics. In short order, Christine became a key player in the Young Comics company, taking on a dual role as Malibu's CEO and CFO. And one of the initiatives Christine pushed for was to branch Malibu into the video game industry. On August 8, 1992, Malibu merged with a California-based company called Acme Interactive. Acme had been incorporated in 1991 and worked primarily on licensed sports games, including Bo Jackson Baseball, David Robinson's Supreme Court, and Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing. Acme became Malibu's new games division under the name of Malibu Interactive, with Christine directly overseeing the new division. Years later, she reflected on her time running the games division as a point of pride during her time at Malibu. On her LinkedIn profile, she lists one of her accomplishments as, quote, took control of acquired video game company, inheriting challenging situation where 12 of the 16 projects were behind schedule, led major restructuring, implemented formal development processes, and brought division to profitability within 9 months, end quote. Malibu, like Acme before it, did a bunch of work on licensed games, including the Genesis and Sega CD versions of Batman Returns, Joe Montana's NFL Football for the Sega CD.
Montana back to pass.
Where'd that truck come from?
In addition, they did the Genesis tie-in for Three Ninjas Kick Back, and my personal favorite, the Genesis version of BattleTech. However, Malibu's time in the games industry, while productive with 19 games released in 3 years, proved short-lived. The early 90s were not kind to Malibu or the American comics industry in general. The company lost its lucrative deal with Image, and the previously booming comics market was starting to turn sour on its way to a huge market collapse. As a result, in around 1994, Malibu began negotiations for DC Comics to acquire Malibu. However, DC's major rival Marvel was having none of it, and they bought Malibu out from under DC, announcing the acquisition of Malibu on November the 3rd, 1994. By all accounts, Marvel's interest in Malibu was exclusively in shutting DC out of the company's small market share of the American comics industry. One of the casualties of the Marvel acquisition was Malibu Interactive. Marvel already had a licensing deal in place with Acclaim, and clearly had no interest in sacrificing that for Malibu's smaller, less established games division. As a result, the company sold off Malibu Interactive to a company called GameTech. However, one person who wasn't around by the time Marvel jettisoned Malibu's games division was Christine Shu, who left the company in May 1994. But Christine was not ready to leave the games industry, and she took what she learned managing Malibu Interactive to form her own game company later that year that she called Paradox Development. Like a lot of game firms during the 1990s, Paradox Development operated as a work-for-hire company, contracting for major publishers who bankrolled and provided administrative oversight for their projects. In this fashion, during the mid-1990s, they worked with the likes of Namco, Interplay, and Electronic Arts on such titles as Blackthorn for the Sega 32X, Shockwave Assault for the Saturn and PC, and the awkwardly named Negotiable, which was a baseball simulator for the PC that ended up never getting released.
As we all age, we all find some things in our lives or on our persons become a little more negotiable.
Oh my God.
And I don't expect that joke to survive the edit necessarily.
Kevin, what was Negotiable about?
It almost sounds like it could have been like a baseball management sim, more than the. Oh, okay. So
that's what I meant. Yeah.
I took that in a different direction, Andy. I thought it was like, what would it take for you to give up one of your balls? You could have this yacht for one of your balls. Oh, geez. What's the maintenance going to be like on that?
I bet you we're like 5 years away from a game show of just that.
There already is a real life Squid Game, right?
Wait, is there?
They're supposed to be developing a real life Squid Game. I assume people are going to die, but who knows?
Yeah, I think my guess is it'll be like Squid Game, but without the death. But, it's one of those cases of let's totally miss the point of the social commentary of the original thing. And just, almost like you would read a book like Snow Crash and think, this metaverse sounds like a...
All right. Around the same time, Paradox Development entered a contract with Virgin Interactive Entertainment to develop an original IP for the Sony PlayStation. Now, Virgin Interactive was originally founded in 1983 and worked throughout the 80s both as a development company and a publisher for Virgin Media. During the early 1990s, Virgin Interactive had a high-profile deal with Disney and put out a bunch of tie-in games for some of Disney's movies, including The Jungle Book, Aladdin, and The Lion King. As an aside, Can't Wait to Be King can go fuck right off. And I'm talking about the level in the Lion King video game, not the song.
Is that the one where you just have to get thrown all over the place by monkeys and trees?
Yes. And you have to ride on the back of an ostrich and not get hit by oncoming branches. That level sucks.
This game sounds hilarious, though.
You look up some videos about this. It's infuriating. By about 1993, Virgin was looking to get out of the video game business and started selling off large stakes in Virgin Interactive to Hasbro and Blockbuster. On June the 29th, 1994, Virgin reached a deal with Blockbuster to give them a 75% share in Virgin Interactive Entertainment, which Blockbuster then traded to Spelling Entertainment for $165 million in common stock. Now, some of our listeners of a certain age may recognize the namesake of Spelling Entertainment, one Aaron Spelling, who was an influential TV producer behind such shows as Dynasty, Beverly Hills 90210,
and Melrose Place.
Yeah. And I'm going to be honest, the only reason I mentioned Virgin Interactive Entertainment's background is because I feel it makes what is to come all the more funny and weird thinking that Aaron Spelling was somehow involved with it. So yeah, Aaron Spelling presents a lot of what we're going to talk about now. Paradox Development's pitch to Virgin Interactive was a game based on the ancient Mesoamerican ritual sport puck to puck, which is a kind of blending of soccer, rugby, and basketball. It's a team sport that involves trying to knock a hard rubber ball through a hoop using your hips, knees, or elbows. Paradox basically wanted to adapt the sport into a game with players assuming the role of big burly Aztec-themed guys as they punched and kicked their way to points in kind of a Mesoamerican-themed NFL blitz. And Virgin appeared to be on board with the idea, and the folks at Paradox Development got to work on the game, which they were reportedly calling Earth Monsters. However, as development progressed, the higher-ups at Virgin Interactive kept giving Paradox the same note: make the game more violent. This progressed to the point that the sports elements kind of faded away in favor of brutal hits and executions, and eventually somebody just spoke up and said, hey, why don't we just do a fighting game instead? So they did that, and Paradox pivoted away from puck to puck in favor of a full-on violent fighting game. Now, looking at the trends in the video game industry at the time, you can see Virgin Interactive Entertainment's logic in pushing Paradox in this direction. And you alluded to this already, Phil, because fighting games were all the rage in the 1990s, dating back to Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat effectively conquering the arcades. And as a result of this, every Tom, Dick, and Primal Rage tried to make their fortune with one-on-one fighters. And for more on that, check out our episode on the relationship between Mortal Kombat and mass incarceration. By the middle of the decade, the genre was shifting away from 2D fighters into the third dimension. So games with navigable 3D arenas using polygon-based fighters. Games that did this were things like Sega's Virtua Fighter, which first hit the arcades in 1993, Namco's Tekken and Soul Edge, which launched in 1994 and 1995, and both launching long-running franchises, and Hudson Soft's, in my opinion, criminally underrated Bloody Roar series, which launched in 1997. Even Mortal Kombat got into this trend, with 1997's Mortal Kombat 4 ditching the series' traditional aesthetics for 3D and polygons. So how then can a small studio like Paradox, pushing a new IP, stand out in a crowded arena of fighters? Paradox decided to go big on a technical level and try to make something that really hadn't been done before, and that was 4-player simultaneous fighting. This was a big task in the mid-1990s. And so Paradox wanted to say, we're going to try for 4 players. That'll be our big thing that separates this game. It was really ambitious. Made even more ambitious because they're making this game for the PS1, and the Sony PlayStation natively only allowed for 2 players. You needed to buy a multi-tap to allow for up to 4 players. So this is really ambitious what they're trying. However, Virgin Interactive wasn't merely content with a technically ambitious game, no siree. They knew that what really brought the gaming boys to the yard was the double whammy of sex and violence, and every step of the way, they kept pushing for Paradox to go bigger in the blood and boob categories. This was also the gaming style of the time, with basically every company trying to out-doom Doom or up the Mortal Kombat ante, and I'm looking at you, Tattoo Assassins, with your 2,196 fatalities. And basically every game was just lousy with explosions and women in bikinis and declarations that John Romero was going to make you his bitch. Now, if you recall from our big deep dive into the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, which you haven't listened to yet, go ahead and check it out. In the wake of the moral panic that led to the creation of the rating system in 1994, video game manufacturers found themselves with greater protection to make games that push cultural boundaries without fear of legal reprisal or government censorship, effectively reasoning that if a parent didn't want their kids exposed to that kind of stuff, maybe don't buy that copy of M-rated Bone Storm for precious 9-year-old Adria. Another lesson that game developers took away from the panic in 1993 was that an easy way to get popular was to offend moral conservatives in the hopes that they would cause a fuss and give the game a bunch of free publicity. I mean, if Night Trap could wind up on the evening news, what's stopping Virgin Interactive from achieving the same success with their new game? Who doesn't want to sell the game that even Congress doesn't want you to play? As a result, there was definitely an incentive for companies to cram in as much sex and violence into their games as they could get away with in hopes of stoking a controversy. And if you need a refresher on a game company desperately trying to get this kind of attention, let me remind you that this is also the same time when Running with Scissors put out Postal. And for more on that, check out our previous episode.
Just real quick, if I could go back in time and give a video game creator in the 90s a piece of advice, it would be, listen, you don't even need to go through the effort of putting the violence in video games into your game. You just need to trick Joe Lieberman into thinking that there's violence and sex in your game. And then he'll do all the work for you.
You should set up a consulting firm. You can save people so much money.
Yeah, just like send him an issue of Playboy, but like cross off Playboy and write Thrill Kill on it.
Going back to Earth Monsters, as a result of these market forces, executives at Virgin Interactive were definitely interested in having a controversial fighting game to call their own. However, they did some focus testing and came to Paradox development with some bad news. The big burly Aztec 2s just weren't testing well. So Virgin Interactive wanted the guys at Paradox to take their violent fighting game in a different creative direction. Now, the person overseeing the project for Virgin was the hilariously named Harvard Bonin. And Harvard Bonin met with some of the people at Paradox, and boy howdy, did he have a new creative direction for this game. And I'm going to let assistant producer Brian Gomez relay the account he gave to Stephen Wright for Variety in a 2019 article, which I'll include in the notes. Quote, when we first started, they were more superhero types. But then we hear from Harvard and he say, let's play up the characters. The punching and kicking is cool, but I want to rip guys' heads off. They wanted the female characters sexier, make the breasts bigger, make the costumes smaller. So I knew we were going on that kind of trajectory. But still, I'll never forget when we had that meeting. And this is a story I often tell people. When Harvard walked into the office with a big stack of fetish magazines, some German like Skin 2, a big cardboard box of some DVDs of like BDSM stuff. And he said, boys, here's your new art direction. It was a massive pivot, maybe the biggest I've ever seen at a games project. I remember asking him, how the hell did you even know what this is? And he basically said that he bought it at a swap meet for £5, basically out of the back of somebody's van. And I'm just sitting there dumbfounded, end quote.
Wouldn't you love to have been in that meeting?
So it sounds like Harvard Bonin went to the Harvard of Bonin.
Nice.
No, Kevin, are we sure that Harvard Bonin isn't really just Conan O'Brien wearing a fake mustache and glasses?
Now, listen, I got on our meeting, our head of our marketing department, the masturbating bear.
Oh, God.
I could not imagine what this meeting would have been like.
And I guess well, I don't know. I was going to say it's a meeting that could not take place now because you brought those into a meeting. You'd just be fired immediately for sexual harassment. But, I think, unfortunately, news in the last couple of years has shown that video game work culture has not progressed, unfortunately, to that point yet. So.
Oh, God. It's all terrible. It's never good. So there you have it. Harvard Bonin was determined that Paradox Development make for them the most violent, kinkiest fighting game imaginable, full of murderous folks in skin-tight leather bondage outfits and gimp suits, eager to beat the ever-loving piss out of each other. Now, reportedly, the new game's original working title was the extremely direct name of S&M, which was apparently short for slaughter and mutilation. However, that name was eventually discarded, and on March the 2nd, 1998, Virgin Interactive Entertainment filed an application with the United States Patent and Trademark Office for a video game program with the name Thrill Kill. Now, Brian Gomez crafted the story providing the framing device for Thrill Kill's horny action. Now, having seen some footage of Thrill Kill and hearing the description of Harvard Bonin's art direction, anybody want to guess what the story he came up with for this game?
You wake up imprisoned in a cell, and then the TV turns on. But it's just like a puppet mask, and it says, there are 4 of you, and only one of you will be allowed to leave alive.
They're all at a rave, but there's only enough ecstasy for one person. So all of these S&M folks are going to fight to the death so that somebody can feel like everything is made of bubbles.
I wish that was the story. Now I want that to be the story of this game. What about you, Alfred? What do you think that the story they crafted around this game?
Well, from what I saw, I see a little fantasy in there. So maybe what you have is a situation where all these fantastical creatures are imprisoned, and the warden has promised them a great reward if they win the championship of the Mortal Kombat match.
Alfred, have you played Thrill Kill? That's pretty damn close, actually.
Wow.
So story-wise, Thrill Kill is a little bit of Eternal Champions challengers from the dark side, mixed with Twisted Metal, wrapped in a leather daddy outfit. The game takes place in hell, so not a prison, but hell, and it centers around Maruka, the god of secrets, who eventually gets bored with the normal demonic grind and decides she's going to put on a fighting tournament involving 8 damned souls under her charge, with the winner earning the chance to return to the world of the living. Now, according to the developer's unofficial website for the game, the characters' appearances are, quote, the physical manifestations of their mental illness or vices on Earth, end quote. I don't know how well that translates out in the game. It's mostly just a whole bunch of people decked out in leather and chains.
I mean, if I were condemned to this game, I would have to fight everybody with nothing but cannolis, and that would be like a really challenging fight.
This is seeming like Dante's Inferno here. So now you're dead in hell, and you're like the manifestation of your psyche. I'm thinking, I hope I don't end up a unicorn. That would be embarrassing.
Alfred, like my only choice would be to try to kill people with cholesterol, and that would take a very long time.
I think I would be transformed into a couch with a video game controller stuck to it.
We'd all be like, we love Andy. He's so warm and welcoming.
I'm really curious how they'll manifest my anxiety and alcoholism in this game. So as I said before, fights are 4-player matches that take place over a series of 3 rounds. There are no health bars in Thrill Kill. Instead, players fight to build up a kill meter, which they fill by landing attacks. The first player to fill their kill meter gains a kill power, allowing them to grab one of their other fighters and execute them in one of a variety of ways. Killing that player eliminates them and ends the round. And the next round starts with the remaining 3 players, and this goes on like that until there are 2 players left. With this time around, the first player to fill out their kill meter now gets to perform what the game calls a thrill kill, which is like a souped up fatality move. So with that in mind, why don't we meet our combatants willing to fight and bleed and kill and die for the chance to live again? Now, these bios that I'm going to do are courtesy of the developer's unofficial website. Our first character we're introduced to is the Tormentor, aka William Whitefield. He's basically the game's Cenobite. In life, he was a judge who deliberately acquitted known criminals so he could track them down and torture them in his personal dungeon.
It seems to me like it would be so much, if you were a judge, it would be so much easier to get access to criminals who were already in jail. You know, you just cozy up with the warden or something and like, hey, send that criminal over to my dungeon. I'll take him off your hands. Nobody will ask any questions.
I was thinking of a slightly different way to go with that. I sentence you to 5 years, and if you need a lift to the jail, I'll be out front with the car running.
Listen, we're going to do some rehabilitation in kind of a one-on-one interactive space. Okay, I've got the things for flaying. No, not flaying. No, did I say flaying? We're going to be filleting some fish. It'll be nice. It's a cooking-based rehabilitation. If you can just bring over that hot poker, I think we could do something with this. Our next one is Oddball. Raymond Raystack was an FBI criminal profiler who tracked down serial killers until he decided to become one. He fights with his arms bound behind his back, relying primarily on kicks. Next, we have Dr. Faustus. Dr. Gabriel Faustus was a plastic surgeon who liked testing, let's say, creative procedures on his patients as well as himself. His favorite procedure involved grafting a bear trap to people's faces in place of their mouth. On an unrelated note, he wound up in hell after dying from an infection brought upon by grafting a bear trap to his face in place of his mouth. Luckily for him, he managed to bounce back and earn a job as health surgeon, because I suppose if you love what you do, you never work a day in your afterlife.
It's kind of cute.
Now, do we think this is a satire about Faust, or do we think this is a satire about Dr. Anthony Fauci?
I call this my Faustus ouchie. Clamp.
All right, our next combatant is Belladonna. And if you're going to have an S&M-themed fighting game, you need a dominatrix. And Belladonna fills that role in Thrill Kill, as well as being the game's poster character. And I'm just going to quote her bio straight from the developer's website, because it has some prose that certainly tells a lot about the preferences of somebody involved with this game. Quote, Belladonna is the epitome of the femme fatale, alluring and exotic, but deadly in every way, as evidenced by her cattle prod and latex-clad body. Don't let the maid's uniform fool you. Belladonna serves no one. To get close to her is to tempt death, for there's nothing she enjoys more than the intimacy of driving a 6-inch stiletto heel into the groin of a would-be suitor. I feel like I need to open a window. Formerly a prim, proper wife and librarian, her interest changed for the worse when she found her husband cheating on her with her sister. Neither survived her wrath, unquote.
I feel like I'm glad I haven't met her.
All right, our next one is Mammoth. Mammoth is the game's obligatory heavy. He's basically a big featureless gorilla-looking guy who was once Franklin Peppermint, an irate postal worker with a hilarious name, who, you guessed it, went postal after losing his job because Thrill Kill was made in the 1990s and was basically against the law to not have a disgruntled postal worker joke.
You gotta be fucking kidding me.
Dude, I would love to see the postal dude in Thrill Kill.
Well, maybe Mammoth is the postal dude. You know, this is his demonic version of himself.
All right, we go to our next one. The Imp, Billy B. Tattoo, which I'm sure they found as a hilarious nod to the 1970s show Fantasy Island. Billy B. Tattoo is a little person whose only goal in life is to be taller. In the game, he walks on stilts while wearing a leather daddy outfit. Dana Delala, who was an artist for Thrill Kill later recalled they based the imp's appearance on Harvard Bonin, the guy pushing for the over-the-top BDSM stuff in the first place.
In the video we saw, he was looking green. I don't know if it was the video versus a difference, but so in the video, I thought it was a goblin. I didn't even think it was a person. Nevertheless, it's still great that they have an imp on stilts. That's something else.
I'm just glad that it turns out he was already a little person in life, because I was afraid that they were going to say that him being a little person in the game is merely his hellish manifestation. And so I was afraid we were just going to have to cancel this game about killing and dismembering people while wearing S&M outfits for saying that little people should only truly exist as physical manifestations of somebody's evil.
All right, Cletus is our next one. Cletus is a hillbilly cannibal who wields a severed leg as a weapon. That's pretty much it. And one of his appearances looks suspiciously like Hannibal Lecter.
Now, if I were designing this game and this character, I would say that one of his attacks should actually be a risk-reward system where you're not attacking, you're leaving yourself open while you're taking a big old bite of that dismembered leg. But that bite fills up your thrill kill meter. And so you have to balance, like, well, is it worth leaving myself open long enough to get hit in exchange for the big bite I'm going to take?
That's something. And our final main character is Violet. Violet is an Austrian circus contortionist who once killed an attacker who barged his way backstage after a performance, which it sounds like he was asking for it.
And it says that her real name is Violet Beauregard, like
that.
the character from
Charlie and the
Chocolate Factory.
Yeah.
So
Violet, you're turning violet, Violet.
When I first saw this picture, I was thinking of that Two Live Crew song here. I'm thinking Harvard Bonin likely played a big role on the character model here. I don't think this would pass in a game these days.
So yeah, Violet's here. She murdered an attacker. Maybe she also ate meat on a Friday or something because she's in hell. So as with other fighting games, in addition to multiplayer, Thrill Kill has an obligatory single-player campaign where you pick one of these colorful rogues and take them through a series of fights and culminating in a showdown with Maruka herself. The first 5 fights are 4-player bouts with the other playable characters. Beginning in round 6, you fight 2 competitors that you've already fought before, plus one of the game's 2 sub-bosses, a guy named Kane. Kane's a dude who's obsessed with fire who uses fire-based attacks. If you make it through Kane, you then fight a one-on-one match with the other sub-boss, a character named Judas. Judas is a pair of conjoined twins who are joined at the waist such that one acts as legs by walking on their hands while the other fights. And they can kind of tag and flip over and have the other one fight. And one thing that's kind of neat about Judas is that one of his alternate costumes is designed to make each of them look like Ken and Ryu, respectively. And then, of course, if you make it through Judas, you then fight Maruka herself. And if you beat her, you're treated to an ending cinematic of your character going back to Earth. And to be honest, kind of basically doing the same stuff that got them to hell in the first place. My favorite of these is Cletus, who markets a line of sausages made out of human meat. And his ending is just a commercial for his sausages. Also, you can unlock Kane, Judas, and Maruka as playable characters, although Maruka can only be used in versus mode. Reportedly, Virgin first showed off an early build of what came to be Thrill Kill in a closed-door demo at the 1997 Electronics Entertainment Expo, with an open demo at their booth at E3 the following year. And Virgin leaned into the game's sexual angle for their marketing at E3 by arranging for professional models to stand around their booth and pose for pictures in 2 of Belladonna's costumes. One was a dominatrix and the other was a sexy nurse. However, their models never showed up. So undeterred, Virgin had hired a pair of local exotic dancers instead. Unsurprisingly, a pair of booth babes and dominatrix who are posing for photos with mostly dudes in compromising positions attracted the attention of the gaming press. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from the event.
So some of these members of the press getting their pictures taken really decided to play the part.
Because in some ways, people in the games industry have always been this way. When handing out superlatives for the convention, official US PlayStation Magazine gave Thrill Kill their, quote, most gratuitous use of skin, or the Sex Sells Award, end quote. Cringeworthy late 1990s video game marketing stunts aside, Thrill Kill received pretty positive press, and several reporters at the convention noted the game was one of the highlights of the show. A GamePro reporter at E3 described Thrill Kill as, quote, a promising fighter that skillfully blends multiplayer action and gore galore, end quote. Commenting on several violent games displayed at the show, Elizabeth Lee of the Atlanta Journal Journal-Constitution observed, quote, opponents of video game violence would have a field day with some of the new titles, which carry such names as Thrill Kill and boast of innovative ways to knock off opponents, end quote. A writer for PSM called the game in the August 1998 issue, quote, a strangely sick and twisted 4-player fighting game. You must fight your way out of hell by committing atrocities and bloody fatalities. Sounds like a winner, end quote. And a reporter from the Unified Gamers Online press group nominated Thrill Kill for the best fighting game at the show. Pretty good press overall for Thrill Kill. And throughout the summer and into the early fall, game journalists churned out reports on the game's content, observing Thrill Kill was shaping up to be one of the violentest games they had ever seen, potentially giving more established gory titles a run for their money. In their write-up on the game for the August 1998 issue of official US PlayStation magazine, writer Wataru Maruyama wrote, in my opinion, one of the most incredible sentences describing a game I've ever read. Quote, if Mortal Kombat pushed the envelope of violence, then Thrill Kill shoves the same envelope through your eye sockets and rips it out the back of your skull, end quote.
They're laying it on thick.
Nice.
Later warning, quote, the game is not for the squeamish, end quote. Wow, what a sentence. A writer for GamePro noted in their August 1998 issue, quote, parents beware, the thrills and kills in this game could create a new ESRB rating, end quote. Oh, speaking of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board.
Can I have a guess of what the rating would be? Instead of M for mature, would it be P for puerile? Maybe.
Oh, I was just thinking a question mark. Just one big question mark rated.
For that emoji of the hands up. Speaking of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, you might be curious what they thought about Thrill Kill. Virgin Interactive Entertainment sent the review package for Thrill Kill sometime during the summer of 1998. Now, for those unfamiliar with how the ESRB rates games, prior to a game's release, the publisher needs to send a video compilation of its most objectionable content to the Ratings Board's offices in New York, where a panel of raters examine the content and assign an age-based letter rating, as well as a set of descriptors reflecting the game's content. And in a very uncommon move, they assigned the game an AO rating for animated blood and gore and animated violence. So we got an AO game here.
And it's an AO game that was well received at the convention. So that may be unlike other AO rating games that we've talked about in this podcast, right?
To be fair, I don't think that Thrill Kill had a rating yet when it was exhibited at E3. So I don't think that they knew it was going to be an AO game. It just happened to be a fairly well received game that got an AO rating.
Okay.
Now, I don't know if my scale is just screwed up, but what we saw, at least, didn't seem more extreme than Mortal Kombat. It just, I guess it was in a 3D space, but it was shitty PS1 era polygons instead of like photos of real people. So to me, it's a little surprising that the way both the ESRB and the press were saying, like, this is Mortal Kombat, but cranked up to 1 billion. Like, I'm not really seeing it, but of course, I mean, we've seen video of one fight, so I don't know.
Well, I mean, if I were going to guess, and based on the other themes and episodes we've done, it's probably not necessarily the violence, which we've essentially been sensitized to. It's that there's any semblance of a sexual overtone, even though it really isn't, even though it's really just whatever pixelated S&M clothing the characters are wearing. I think that's just a dog whistle. It's some sort of red flag.
Yeah, I think you're right, Phil.
Skipping ahead, I also have some issues with that. And like the amount that people are hyping up this game and the stuff I've seen in this game, yeah, I don't think it was for violence. This thing got an AO rating. We've covered the AO rating a few times on this show, but as a refresher, the AO, or the adults only rating, was created in 1994, along with the rest of the ESRB, and designates a game whose content is only appropriate for people ages 18 and older. When the games industry introduced the AO rating, they basically designed it as a financial kiss of death. In theory, it financially disincentivized game makers from pushing too far in terms of sex and violence because the overwhelming majority of American retailers refused to carry AO games, and some console manufacturers outright refused to allow AO games on their systems. So what this meant is that the rating effectively forced publishers to decide if pushing the envelope was worth effectively kneecapping their game's financial success. As a result, AO-rated games were rare, bearing such illustrious titles as The Joy of Sex for the CDI, which was the first game to ever get an AO rating, as well as the PC games Crystal Fantasy, All Nude Cyber, and Rihanna Rouge. As those names suggest, in practice, games to receive an AO rating have been overwhelmingly based on defective depictions of sex. Other less common reasons for attracting an AO rating have included excessive violence and the presence of gambling. Thus, on paper, it may appear that based on Thrill Kill's descriptors, that this was the first title to receive the AO for violence. And there are a couple websites that will say that this was the first game that got it for violence. However, I'm with you, Phil and Andy. I'm not so sure about that. And I think the game's depiction of sexuality must have played some role in that rating. One interesting thing about the coverage around Thrill Kill is how many games journalists seem to dance around its sexual content. They really hype up the violence. I mean, we've heard some of the sort of hyperbolic descriptions from a game that I would probably say even at the time was not that much more extreme than like Killer Instinct or Mortal Kombat. But I wonder if some of that is them trying to avoid overemphasizing sex, maybe some concern about scandalizing their readers. Again, that's only me speculating. I mean, S&M is a very deliberate design choice, one that's connected to a pretty specific sexual subculture, but everywhere they're talking about the violence and not that.
Unfortunately, what these journalists, unlike me and all of us, erudite people on this podcast, they didn't go to the Harvard of Bonin, and they cannot speak about this with intelligence and sensitivity the way we can and the fine people at Paradox Games could.
Hey, some of us could only afford to go to the Vassar of Bonin, all right? I don't really care for your classist Bonin views here.
I went to the Pen of Bonin. It's still technically an Ivy.
I think even the ESRB raters seem to be kind of dancing around the sexuality stuff. In fact, they give the Thrill Kill descriptions exclusively based on violence. And I do think it's worth mentioning that the home versions of Mortal Kombat 4 received an ESRB rating around the same time and had the exact same descriptors as Thrill Kill, animated blood and gore, and animated violence. Yet Mortal Kombat 4 got an M rating instead of an AO rating. And putting the games side by side, I've looked at fatalities in both games. You could argue that their finishing moves are comparable, if not more graphic, for Mortal Kombat 4. They even have in Mortal Kombat 4 situations where like they cut a body in half and like throw it against the screen and simulated bloods going down the screen. So you could make the case that Mortal Kombat 4 was more violent than Thrill Kill, yet it got a lower rating. And this is only me speculating about this, but it makes me really think that it was the sexuality in Thrill Kill that ultimately pushed it over the edge for an AO rating. And I can also only speculate whether Harvard Bonin was excited he had spearheaded a game that could now be mentioned in the same sentence as all new Nikki and Wet, the sexy empire. Regardless, it was now up to the folks at Paradox to edit the game such that it could find its way into retail shelves. Thus began a back and forth between Paradox and the ESRB about what needed to be cut so Thrill Kill could get an M rating. This is really common. So if a game gets a high rating, the ESRB will send a list of things. These are the reasons it got it. And they could then edit and change it and resubmit it and get a lower rating. This was a process that, according to Dana Zalula at Paradox Development, was anything but straightforward. As he explained to Stephen Wright of Variety, quote, "It was just ridiculous. We were going back and forth over the tiniest things. Some of it made sense. Belladonna had a kill move where we made it seem like she was giving the victim oral sex before killing them. Well, we changed that to her just tickling them. We had her moan as she killed people. Well, that wasn't cool, so we had her only moan at the beginning of a match. Initially, everyone in the game wore thongs, just because we thought that's what they wanted. But the ESRB said, you can't show that much ass, so we gave them panty lines. Is this enough butt cheek covered? I couldn't believe what we were doing," end quote. In a further act of Paradox Development likely attempting to cover their collective asses, not unlike the thongs that they were putting on characters, they put in a disclaimer that appears when you boot up Thrill Kill, declaring, quote, "This game has been rated mature by the ESRB," end quote. And at the bottom of the screen, the player has two options. They can press X and square together, indicating, quote, "I agree to these terms and conditions and proceed at my own risk," end quote, which boots the game up to the title screen. However, if the player presses circle, indicating, quote, "I cannot in good conscience play this game," end quote, the screen will change to the message advising, quote, "Please switch the power off on your console," end quote. So they actually programmed a disclaimer that would show up when you booted up the game, warning people of its objectionable content.
I agree that if I play this game and end up in a sex cult, it's my own damn fault.
With a thong on.
I'm old enough to decide how much ass is okay for me to see.
Just listening to this dialogue and now thinking more about some of the other games we talked about in the 90s and all of the moral panic language around them in terms of what people fear is how these things will affect the way you think. There's sexual content, so will it make our society more sexually promiscuous? It's more violent, so will it encourage our society to be more violent? And I started thinking about that in relation to the dangers of games and apps today. and like what are the dangers that we deal with and fear today. We fear identity theft, we fear monetary theft, and we fear personal physical danger, like including getting doxxed, location tracked, or getting into the wrong Uber and getting abducted. And I haven't fully parsed out all of the different thoughts around how different those things are and what they say around our society, but it's certainly, we just live in such a different time now. And technology has the power to really put people in danger in ways we were kind of fabricating, it feels like, in the 90s.
I mean, the sole reason I stopped employing French maids in the 90s was because they kept filleting me and then trying to murder me. So I don't think any of these were made up.
How many times have I asked you for a recommendation on a French maid and you said nothing? How many?
And every single time I said nothing for your own good.
Oh my.
You're such a wonderful friend.
While all this was happening, Virgin kept marketing Thrill Kill on the weight of its provocative content. For example, a press release on June the 17th, 1998 described the game thusly, quote, Thrill Kill features over-the-top violence and combat between all manner of psychotic deviants. Thrill Kill is definitely not for the faint-hearted or the squeamish. Instead of the usual fighting game fare of kung fu masters and monsters, this frightening bloodbath pits 11 hell-bound freaks, mutants, and crazies against each other and lets them battle it out for a chance to return from purgatory to Earth. End quote. Promising features such as 4-player simultaneous fighting, something they described as advanced artificial intelligence, listed in all caps in the press release, as well as a quote, eerie, pulsating alternative music / goth rock soundtrack, end quote. In addition to that, Virgin put out a 3-page ad that ran in several game magazines between August and September of 1998, with a copy on the first page warning in large print, Thrill Kill contains extremely graphic and violent scenes and subject matter, end quote, and included a set of terms and conditions that read, quote, you must be at least 18 years old to view or play this game. You must not find images of adults engaged in violent acts to be offensive or objectionable. You must understand and take full responsibility for all decisions made in regards to this ad if you breach these terms and conditions, end quote. With the rest of the ad showing images of several of the game's fighters with the slogan on the last page, sadistic 4-player fighting, and promising a fall 1998 release. And several game magazines later clarified that Thrill Kill was going to come out in October of 1998.
I feel like they might have been afraid to lean too hard in their sexy image, but I feel like if I were doing the ads for this game, I would draw some connection between 4-player action and 4-play.
4-play.
Yeah.
The developers at Paradox also chipped in on promoting the game, offering Quake 2 skins of both Dr. Faustus and the Imp for download on their unofficial website. There were even some murmurings of a marketing-friendly moral panic. On September the 5th, 1998, the Canada-based Globe and Mail put out a nearly full-page article warning readers of, stop me if you've heard this one, an oncoming wave of graphic and disturbing games worse than anything that had come before, declaring, quote, major U.S. software companies are about to make such infamous splatter games as Duke Nukem and Doom seem like child's play as they prepare to release a new wave of titles this fall that enable players to manipulate photorealistic images of humans into active torture, mutilation, and even, if you can believe it, prostitution, end quote. Because time is a flat circle. I promise, this time we mean it, that the video games are getting out of control. This time. No, wait, this time. This time they're out of control.
Oh, to go back to the 90s when PS1 graphics looked photorealistic to you. It was a simpler time.
Oh, yes.
I remember the discussions on the school bus of how Final Fantasy VII was the greatest game that anyone ever saw for those graphics.
It's pretty amazing. I think a year or two ago, I sat down to play Final Fantasy VII again. And my childhood memory of that game is amazing. And to see that Cloud's hands are just little spheres, I mean, see how low resolution it is was impressive for me.
Yeah, it's neat the way your perspectives change on it. Like, I remember when everyone was like, Ocarina of Time is the greatest looking game anyone's ever seen. I mean, it's still great. Don't get me wrong, it's still a great game, but it's like, this is the real time when, you know, the games are getting so violent and graphic. Forget about Doom. Doom is, that's so 1991, as Ralph Wicker would say, you know?
Yeah, but no, yeah, I agree with Ocarina of Time. I mean, Link's nose in that game was sharper than the Master Sword.
In this article, one of those potentially dangerous new titles to receive prominent attention was Thrill Kill. Accompanying the article was a huge picture of Dr. Faustus, as well as a shot of Belladonna splayed out in a salacious pose while wearing a skimpy leopard print outfit complete with matching heels, cat ears, and a tail, with the headline, Gaming's New Vixen.
I'm really excited to hear the rest of this story because I feel like it's not that often that an unreleased game still makes it this far into the marketing push. So there's got to be some good moves up ahead.
Yeah, the play-by-play really does feel like it's about to be released and there's no real problem.
That's a great segue because all in all, throughout the summer, things seem to be progressing well. And Thrill Kill appeared to be well on its way to its anticipated October 1998 release. Virgin sent out demo copies to game reviewers. Retailers ran ads and circulars and accepted pre-orders. And several magazines put out strategy guides and move lists for the game, including Tips and Tricks magazine, which featured Thrill Kill on the cover of the October 1998 issue. However, here's the however. Behind the scenes, things were far from sunshine, rainbows, and gimp suits. And a lot of that had to do with the state of Virgin Interactive Entertainment. Now, you may recall that Spelling Entertainment purchased Virgin in 1994 from Blockbuster for $165 million in common stock. Well, by 1998, Aaron Spelling was having a raging case of buyer's remorse. In 1995 and 1996, Virgin Interactive posted about $14 million each year in losses. In 1997, between January and September alone, the company lost $49.5 million.
Wow.
Holy crap.
And as a result, Spelling became pretty upfront about their desire to dump Virgin. On August the 18th, 1998, Spelling found a buyer in that beloved darling of the games industry, Electronic Arts. It's like the entrance music for like Kane coming in now. The screen, the whole room's going red, the dark music playing.
Sorry, as very much still the video game noob, I don't have the backstory or context on EA. And you may have alluded to it, but I don't think I ever really got any of the shit talking. Is now a good time for that, or should we keep moving?
I feel like I've heard that they have a reputation for buying and then closing game studios, that they have a reputation for canceling, really hyped up single player games because they were just like, no, we're only focusing on multiplayer stuff with loot boxes. So those are the things I've heard about EA that make them not great.
From a games perspective, I mean, to me, thinking about like Madden and stuff like that, I thought they had good optics, but I guess that's not the case.
Fans hate EA. Overall, they hate EA. And there are a couple of reasons for that. As Andy has pointed out, they have a long history of buying up well-liked game studios and just shutting them down.
Oh.
For example, Pandemic Studios. People like Pandemic Studios. One of their bigger games was The Saboteur. They were bought by EA in 2008 and they were shut down a year later. DreamWorks Interactive, which made the Medal of Honor series, was bought by EA and then shut down in 2013. You had Origin, which was responsible for Ultimate Wing Commander, was bought by EA in 92. They shut them down in 2004. Westwood Studios, they bought them in 98 and they shut them down in 2003. So some of it is EA has become one of those big monolithic companies where they're just like snatching up lots of smaller development studios and shutting them down or setting them up for failure or adding a whole bunch of stuff people don't want, like microtransactions. Like very famously, for example, Dead Space, right? The game Dead Space is made by a company called Visceral Games. Dead Space 1 is an amazing horror game. By the time they got to the third Dead Space game, they insisted on having tons of crafting mechanics, some of which were tied to microtransactions where you could buy for extra resources to mine stuff. And they insisted on having multiplayer when it's supposed to be an atmospheric horror game. So it's a lot about like appealing to the lowest common denominator and like basically taking anything original and interesting and just like putting through a meat grinder and churning out whatever's left. And when that doesn't sell right because the fans don't like it, they shut the company down, like they did with Visceral, incidentally. A lot of users complain that they have a lack of innovation, especially in the sports titles, especially in like the Madden community, that they basically release the same game every year and don't make any changes or improvements, and anything they make it worse and add things like microtransactions, things like that. So like EA is seen as like one of the big soulless corporations among big soulless corporations in the games industry. Matter of fact, there was I forgot which group does it, where they do like a tournament every year for the most hated companies in the United States, and it's always either Bank of America or EA.
Wow. People hate them as much as a bank.
It was the Consumerists that rated EA as the worst company in America. This was back in April of 2012. They beat out Bank of America.
Wow. So Virgin's video game arm is starting to struggle, and the context is that one of these companies that has a history of buying titles and then shutting them down is now trying to do that here.
At the very least, we have a company that is snatching up some recognizable properties. They're probably not going to do very much with them because the big thing they wanted in this sale was Westwood. So EA announced it purchased Westwood Studios, best known for the Command & Conquer series, from Spelling for $122.5 million in cash. Included in the deal was a significant portion, what one tech writer described as the lion's share of Virgin's gaming properties. So a whole bunch of their gaming stuff has now been sold off to EA. And included in that sale was Thrill Kill. Now, initially, the folks at Paradox were excited by the acquisition, if for no other reason than EA was significantly more stable than Virgin. However, EA, ever the thief of joy, had some bad news for them. On October the 15th, 1998, Electronic Arts put out a public statement announcing that they were canceling Thrill Kill, citing the game's extreme content.
No.
According to Pat Becker, EA's director of corporate communications, quote, "We have to be responsible for the content that we make available to the marketplace. We felt that this was not the kind of title that we wanted to see in the market," end quote. Becker later added that canceling the game had been a high priority for the company after acquiring the rights from Spelling, explaining to a ZDNet reporter, quote, "The decision was made as soon as we could make it after we acquired the company. It wasn't a decision that was made hastily. Our whole executive team was involved in the decision to cancel the game, and we certainly evaluated to see if there was something that we could do to make ourselves more comfortable with the content. The tone and the tenor of the game are just too violent," end quote. Now, while EA reportedly consulted their entire executive team on whether to permanently banish Thrill Kill to the Stygian pit from whence it came, there was, however, one group of people they clearly didn't check with: Paradox Development. Several former employees at Paradox later recalled that they heard about Thrill Kill's demise when they read about it on the internet. According to producer Kevin Mulhall, quote, "We read it on the internet. It's not a case of 6 guys in suits coming down from EA to let us down softly. They didn't even give enough of a shit to tell us in person," end quote.
That's a shame, man.
Now, reportedly, several companies, including Eidos and Acclaim, expressed interest in taking Thrill Kill off of EA's hands. However, on top of not releasing Thrill Kill, EA also made sure that people knew that the game would, to quote lead programmer Dave Ullman, remain, quote, "on the highest, darkest shelf, never to be let down," end quote. EA making it clear that they had no intention of allowing anyone else to publish the game, announcing in the same statement that they would accept no offers for the rights. When EA made that announcement, the game was basically finished and reportedly mere weeks from release.
Listen, us buying this is the equivalent of diving on a grenade for the rest of the human race. No one should ever see the extreme content in this game. EA gonna EA, I guess, you know?
We need to save your precious, fragile minds from this.
I mean, is there any inside information as to why? Do we know what the conversations were like, or is it obvious?
That's a good question. I don't have any insights from people at EA. I have a couple of suppositions that I can make about EA's decision, kind of looking at what was going on at EA and what was going on in the industry at the time, and kind of what was going on in the US at the time. But I will say this, going on that point, one of the offshoots of me doing this show is that at this point, my heart is nothing but a dried up apple doll head of cynicism. And I find it really hard to believe that Electronic Arts was shit can Thrill Kill simply on the basis of corporate responsibility. I think it's personally really telling that they made such a big production out of saying that they were both shelving Thrill Kill on the basis of its content and making sure that no one else would get to it. It's very telling to me that they're not just saying, you know, we're canceling the game. That happens all the time. Like, games will get canceled for a variety of reasons, but they're like, not only are we not releasing this game, the content is too awful, and we need to make sure that no one gets this game, and we will absolutely not sell this to anybody. Like, that's a bit extra when it comes to game cancellations.
I mean, maybe I missed this context, but why buy the company in the first place?
I mean, I think that they were looking for Westwood and they were looking for the other Virgin properties. Spelling were dumping ballast, and EA was the one who bought up all that stuff. And I don't think that they deliberately sought out Thrill Kill. I think they just happened to get Thrill Kill, and they're like, okay, we need to axe this game.
I see. So Virgin was selling off all of its video game industry properties. It was just getting out of the business, and EA bought everything.
Yeah, it was a fire sale. They were getting out.
Okay.
this whole story, your explanation of it really does put EA as the model of the shabby corporation that's just, wreaking its havoc through the gaming system, not intentionally. This situation with Paradox just sounds like a corporate business. They bought Paradox just because it was part of something, and then maybe they didn't want to pay salaries anymore to these people. They didn't care about it. It really stinks, Who knows what would have happened if this game had come out? That's an interesting idea.
So yeah, all of this is to say that I think it's telling that they made such a big production about trying to be responsible and do right by the public and all this stuff. And the way I think about it is doing the right thing is usually not high on a soulless corporation's list of priorities. So that leads me to think that if they did have ulterior motives, then that raises the question, did canceling Thrill Kill give Electronic Arts some other kind of non-financial benefit? Now, assuming for the sake of argument that this is the case, I want to offer you some context as to what may have been going through the heads of EA executives when they decide to kill Thrill Kill. I'm going to preface this, however, by saying I have no definitive answer about why EA decides to shelve Thrill Kill. As far as I know, I haven't seen any accounts by current or former EA executives about what the decision-making process was. I can make some educated guesses based on the state of EA and the public perception of video games, especially of violent video games in late 1998. And what I'm going to offer is a possible hypothesis for why they do this and why they do it in the way they do it. So first off, EA's lineup in 1998 overwhelmingly favored games designed to have as broad a market appeal as possible, such as licensed sports titles, long-running series, and games based on recognizable TV shows and movies. In short, safe, proven commodities with well-established fan bases. For example, titles released by Electronic Arts in 1998 included Road Rash 3D, Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit, Ultimate Collection, Madden 99, NHL 99, Tiger Woods PGA Tour Golf, the PlayStation version of Diablo, and tie-in games to Jurassic Park, Small Soldiers, and Reboot. Thrill Kill, on the other hand, was a brand new IP with no substantial brand recognition or built-in fan base. On top of that, it would be a fighting game forced to compete on the PS1 with the likes of Tekken, Bloody Roar, and Soul Edge. And all of that is before you even factor in the fetish porn aesthetic and the over-to-the-top violence. And all that, by my estimation, points to a game that was probably going to be at best a moderately selling niche title. On top of that, video game violence as a political issue had reemerged in 1998, thanks in no small part to a series of high-profile school shootings between late 1997 and the middle of 1998. Now, brief content warning for a very, very short talk on mass shootings. On December the 1st, 1997, a freshman at Heath High School in West Paducah, Kentucky, opened fire at a prayer group meeting before class, killing 3 and wounding 5 others. On March the 24th, 1998, 2 students opened fire at Westside Middle School outside of Jonesboro, Arkansas, killing 4 students and 1 teacher and wounding 10 others. 2 months later, in May of 1998, a freshman at Thurston High School in Springfield, Oregon, killed his parents and then opened fire at his school, killing 2 students and wounding 25. The 3 shootings attracted national media attention. I mean, this is a simpler time in America when headlines about mass death events involving school children was not just a mundane part of our everyday existence. We still, as a culture, seem to care about this stuff. Way to go, America.
Like we said earlier, it was a simpler time.
Yeah. So all this attracted national media attention. And as a result, legions of reporters, pundits, lawmakers, and self-proclaimed experts trotted out a variety of potential causes for the carnage, which inevitably led some to argue that violent media, especially violent video games, were to blame. I really, really hate repeating myself on this show. For example, in a New York Times article following the Thurston High School shooting, a reporter cited one local parent who felt he spoke for many parents in Springfield when he said that Marilyn Manson and our old friend Postal were likely to blame. On June the 19th, 1998, in response to the shootings, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops composed a resolution calling on American bishops to take a more active role in campaigning against media violence. And as someone who was raised Catholic, I find this as an interesting move on the part of the church, given their typical response to things that are harmful to children. I mean, why not simply encourage the likes of Mortal Kombat 2 and Postal to move to another parish?
Oh,
Damn!
oh my God.
Going right for the jugular.
That's the most venomous thing you've said on this podcast. Yes.
We had the neighborhood got a letter from the town PTA where I'm at. They were denouncing a speaker that the local Catholic church up the street hosted, who was this guy who was apparently like an ardent anti-LGBT, anti-women's rights kind of guy, and just spouted off on all this stuff, which then became a conversation in the local Facebook group, which created the inevitable both sides in conversation where people were like, you know what, we should hear this guy out kind of stuff. And it's like, fuck these guys, fuck that church for allowing that, and fuck the situation we're in. That's what I say. Anywho, speaking of angry Christians, the role of video games in violent crime was the cover story for the August the 10th, 1998 edition of Christianity Today, which was published a little more than a week before EA finalized their deal to buy the rights to Thrill Kill. In an article titled Train to Kill, the author argued that violent video games cause school shootings by both training children to effectively use firearms and psychologically conditioning them to kill without hesitation or remorse. If that line of reasoning sounds familiar, it may be because the guy who wrote that was our old friend, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman.
I wonder if he's still doing consultations.
Absolutely he is. 100% still does it. There were tons of articles after George Floyd's murder about Dave Grossman, and his argument is basically that he had it coming. He pretty much thinks that 100% of the time, if a police officer kills a suspect, police officer was in the right.
Well, I mean, listen, I've never walked a mile in Dave Grossman's shoes, but there's one thing I sort of agree with him on, because I think 100% of the time, if a little person on stilts kills 3 other condemned people in hell in order to return to the land of the living, 100% of the time, he's in the right to do so.
And now we're getting political.
Now we're getting political.
And what will be the talking point when he's being defended in court? If he's on stilts, he's got no guilt.
Ah! Oh, man. Thank you for bringing this to a more fun place. I will say, for the benefit of our new listeners, Dave Grossman is a former West Point professor turned killology expert, which is a field of psychology that Dave Grossman made up that he claims is the study of what causes people to kill. And we'll save a detailed look at Grossman and why I think it's dangerously irresponsible to listen to him for another day. But for now, I'll remind listeners that he's made quite a living for himself teaching seminars to cops where he encourages them to kill without hesitation or remorse. Several lawmakers also vowed to tackle the violent video game menace. On March the 3rd, 1998, Florida State Representative Barry Silver and Florida State Senator John Grant introduced the Children's Protection from Violence Act into the Florida legislature. The proposed bill banned the public display or exhibition of any video game containing, quote, graphic violence, unquote, effectively banning any violent video game content from being visible from any public place, such as from the street. It also banned anyone under the age of 18 from entering any establishment that had video games that fit under the law and required arcade patrons to show proof of ID before entering. Violators were subject to a fine of $5,000 for the first offense and $10,000 for each subsequent offense, with money collected from fines earmarked, quote, for treatment of injuries of victims of violent crime, end quote, which I guess is one way to fund universal health care. When asked if he was concerned whether the bill risked violating free speech, Silver explained to a Sun Sentinel reporter that he thought the First Amendment was a small price to pay for protecting kids from the likes of Duke Nukem and Redneck Rampage, saying, quote, some are worried about a slippery slope if we begin this kind of restriction, but I'm far more concerned about the moral abyss our children are sliding into, unquote.
That slippery slope can start at the First Amendment, but oddly enough, it stops hard at the Second Amendment.
Wow, how that worked out.
So this is a children's protection law, which is about the age required to purchase video games.
It's not a purchasing law. It's an exhibition law. So any place where a person could see publicly a game that has violent content in public places. And it also bans minors from being inside establishments that have games like that.
At this point in time, if those kids couldn't get in, could they just go to a gun shop and like buy a rifle to keep themselves entertained? I mean, this is a children's protection law. I just want to know what this is about. Wait, this is clearly about guns, right? No, it's about video games. All right, sure. I'm an idiot. Why would I have thought otherwise?
I'm not an expert on this, but this is Florida.
The person checking IDs at arcades was, I think, an actual alligator.
Interestingly, the Florida House Committee on Civil Justice and Claims researched the legality of the bill and came back with a laundry list of problems, many of which will be familiar to listeners of our previous episode on Brown v. EMA. These included a broad, vague definition of graphic violence and a concern that it would not hold up to a court challenge on First Amendment grounds. Also, the bill's original wording made it illegal for anyone to display violent video game content where it could be seen by the public. And researchers pointed out that this theoretically made a person playing Mortal Kombat in the privacy of their own home subject to a $5,000 fine if their TV just happens to face a window visible from a public street. As a result, the bill officially died in committee on May the 1st, 1998. Now, all that's to say that there's no doubt that EA executives were paying close attention to public concerns over video game violence. For example, this Florida bill got a lot of attention in the gaming press. So obviously execs at EA are aware of this. In fact, it's worth mentioning that Electronic Arts have been a key player in building public confidence in the video game industry, especially with lawmakers at this time. You may recall from our previous episode on the congressional hearings that led to the creation of the ESRB, it was an EA executive, namely company VP Jack Highstand, who was influential in bringing Nintendo, Sega, and a bunch of the other major industry players to the table to create a trade organization and the rating system. Highstand served as the first head of the Interactive Digital Software Association and acted as the spokesperson who introduced lawmakers to the Entertainment Software Ratings Board back in 1994. Now, Highstand had left the company in 97, but he definitely helped build a reputation for Electronic Arts as a company willing to work closely with lawmakers such as U.S. Senator and vocal video game critic Joe Lieberman, who had previously threatened federal regulation if the industry couldn't regulate itself. As a result, EA putting out a violent and sexually explicit game like Thrill Kill may have run the risk of being seen by the likes of Joe Lieberman as a betrayal, a company committed to corporate responsibility, giving into the pressures of morally objectionable content and putting profits ahead of America's children. And if they couldn't even trust EA, maybe video games needed outside regulation. Kevin Mulhall, again, one of the Paradox employees, later told Stephen Wright of Variety he thought this may have factored into EA's decision, saying, quote, "I mean, this was the era of Lieberman and Hillary Clinton talking about the effects of violent games on the kids. It was everywhere, and we all felt like execs at EA were close to that sort of crowd, and it would be hard for them to publish a game like Thrill Kill, so they canned it," end quote. Therefore, I feel that as a result of Thrill Kill's niche content, its limited sales potential in a crowded fighting game market, public anxieties over violent video games, and fears of potential backlash from lawmakers, that I think that the executives of EA may have done the math and found that Thrill Kill be more valuable as a PR move than a consumer product, a sacrificial lamb at the altar of moral crusaders and lawmakers to present an air of corporate responsibility. This was a move that, given the political landscape over video games in 1998, was potentially more valuable than any possible sales of the game could have earned. And this is why I think Electronic Arts not only canceled Thrill Kill, but made such a public production out of it.
Very interesting.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not just, well, let's cutting our losses, but let's turn this into a good story for us.
Yeah, I think it was all about spin, because now in the public eye, one could view Electronic Arts as not only canceling a violent and sexually explicit game on the basis of its content, but by refusing to sell the rights, they're effectively protecting the public from the game's potential corrupting influences. And in a time of violent school shootings and Dave Grossman, EA, by shelving Thrill Kill, could be seen as part of the solution rather than a contributor to the problem. That being said, the news still came as a shock, especially since the game was basically finished and ready to go. As a result, that decision made more than a few fans upset, and upon hearing of Thrill Kill's demise at the hands of EA, angry gamers in 1998 did what angry gamers in 1998 did best. They took to the internet to complain. Numerous Thrill Kill fan sites cropped up, with angry gamers denouncing EA and imploring another company to sweep in and save Thrill Kill from the abandonware trash bin. Some also tried to take action, such as creating online petitions, attempting to organize phone and email blitzes to EA's corporate offices, or calling for boycotts of EA games. One such fan put on their website a list of, quote, ways to tell EA to go to hell, end quote, including inundating the company with emails demanding they release the game, explaining to readers, quote, they'll get sick of it sooner or later and we'll have to do something about it, end quote. And boycotting the company, with the writer adding, quote, lately they've been coming out with a lot of crappy games anyway. Thrill Kill must be too high above their standards, end quote. Some even reached out to gaming news outlets offering to buy their demo copies from them. Now, with all this going on, you might wonder how the folks at Paradox Development responded to Electronic Arts basically doing the equivalent of breaking up via tweet. But before I tell you what they did, I'm going to present you with three options. Did they A, pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and move on to the next job with another publisher? I mean, after all, it's just business. B, coordinate with fans to petition EA to change their mind and sell the rights to another company. Or C, spend the next 20 plus years complaining how political correctness and corporate cowardice silence your artistic vision. What do we think?
I mean, I don't want to jump ahead. We always know that the answer is C, but I think that's an incomplete answer. I think what they did is they've not only complained about political correctness, but then they stopped directing comedy films and switched to directing movies like The Joker instead, because you just can't make a comedy film anymore without offending somebody.
It sounds very of the moment now for them to have done C, which is to complain about how everyone is against them.
I'll go with C.
Well, longtime listeners will know that whenever I offer you a choice like that, The answer is always C, except this time it's actually A.
What?
What?
I gotta keep you guys on your toes.
No.
I can't
Oh,
make it that
you
easy.
got us.
Well, hey, kudos to the fine people at Paradox, who are the first protagonists of the Skittles Games episode to ever behave like rational adults who can move on from a setback.
Now, for
Yeah,
a company that actually did option C, check out our episodes on Postal and Postal 2.
Kevin, I have to say, it's really freaking me out how all of the decisions being made right now make sense.
I know this is a lot more rational than we usually get on the show.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, at the end of the day, Paradox Development was a jobbing video game company in a time before digital distribution, and they knew that, and they were in absolutely no position to burn bridges. On the upside, while they lost Thrill Kill, they could leverage the time they spent on it to show to other publishers that they had fighting game development experience. And on top of that, while EA owned the rights to Thrill Kill, Paradox owned the 4-player fighting game engine on which it ran, so they could leverage that to other companies. As Paradox producer Kevin Mulhall explained to Stephen Wright of Variety, quote, "You basically sold one game to a publisher at a time and then R&D'd 3 or 4 different games off that. You try to use the one solid thing to make the thing you actually wanted to make. And when something would fall through, you'd say, oh, is there a way we can make this into something we'd actually want to make? It was a very haphazard way of doing things, but it was the only way back then, at least for a studio like Paradox," end quote. Now, initially, Paradox attempted to adapt Thrill Kill, minus all the kinky sex stuff imposed on them by Harvard Bonin, into an original fighting game that they tentatively titled Fubar. However, Fubar never materialized, and the company just ended up moving on to other projects. Fast forward a year later. Paradox Development had entered a working relationship with Activision. In October the 31st, 1999, they released Wu-Tang Shaolin Style. Now, stop me if any of this sounds familiar. Wu-Tang Shaolin Style is a 3D fighting game created by Paradox Development, where players take on the role of members of the Wu-Tang Clan as they fight in violent battles with up to 4 players in one of a series of confined arenas where the winner can execute his opponent in one of several gruesome ways. In short, Wu-Tang Shaolin Style was basically Thrill Kill with a new coat of paint and a couple of gameplay tweaks. Kevin Mulhall later recalled that the two games from a technical standpoint were about 70% identical. Wu-Tang Shaolin Style was a modest success. It sold a couple of 100,000 copies and attracted mostly positive reviews from critics and fans. So Paradox could proudly say that people got to experience Thrill Kill in some form.
And not by just like sneakily releasing it under the name Calm Kill or something like that.
Hold on to that, because I have one more sentence I need to read in the script here.
Oh.
Did I mention that there was another way people could experience Thrill Kill? They could download it off the internet, because not too long after EA canned Thrill Kill, someone, probably an irate Paradox Development employee, although it's never been confirmed who did this, leaked several builds of the game online where people could download them for free, including what appears to be the final retail version. As a result, another way that spurned fans could stick into EA was to pirate Thrill Kill and play it off an emulator or a modded PS1. And tons of those websites encourage people to do that. Tell EA to go fuck themselves by downloading this illegally. So I went and did that. And I'm here to offer my brief thoughts on playing Thrill Kill. Now, listeners will know I'm no stranger to deliberately controversial games. I've completed the first Postal. I've gotten a decent way through Postal 2, or at least according to Steam achievement statistics, at least further than 76% of its player base. As a result of that, I kind of came in thinking that Thrill Kill was just going to be another one of these sort of like late 90s, early aughts, like edgelord garbage, like gritty for the sake of being gritty, reading Fight Club the wrong way kind of gritty. I was actually pleasantly surprised by this game. It's got a pretty solid combat system. It's got a really good combo system. Like I've seen videos online, you can chain combos pretty effectively in this game and pretty fluidly. It looks really cool and it's really satisfying when you pull them off. There's also a pretty good counter system there too. So the combat that's the bones of this game is pretty good. It also is really impressive that they did that 4-player stuff. Like games really didn't do that at the time. Given what it is and given the platforms up, it's pretty impressive what they're able to accomplish. It also, again, I thought it was going to be like really edgy, gritty for the sake of it. It's got a surprising amount of humor. For example, there are tons of alternate costumes. You can unlock like silly joke ones. Like for example, Oddball, the guy who's got his arms tied behind his back. One of his alternates is a armless teddy bear. One of Mammoth's is a clown. One of Violet's is a mime. The Imp has a devil costume. Kane has a firefighter costume he can wear. On top of that, you can do like violent finishers and fatalities, but they also added dance finishers. And one of them involves Belladonna putting aside her differences with her opponent so they both do the Macarena, kids asking their parents.
That's cool.
I mean, there are definitely better fighter games that came out around the same time. If I were to give it probably like a 6 or 7 out of 10, it was okay. It was more than I was expecting when I played it. I do have some complaints about this game. Those fights get hard quickly in the single player mode. The difficulty spikes pretty fast. I like fighting games, but I'm absolute garbage at them. I was able to button mash my way through about the first 3 or 4 matches. And then after that, the AI just started wrecking me, especially big old Mammoth, because he's got an insane amount of reach. All of his stuff does tons of damage and he can rack up his kill meter really fast. But one thing that's kind of funny though is the AI kind of doesn't know what to do once someone's got a kill move, or not. That's actually not true. So once someone gets a kill move, they'll go from straight up aggroing somebody to trying to get away from the person who's got it as quickly as possible. So you'll see the AI back away. That's all it does is try to back away into the nearest corner. And that's the other thing. Once a person gets a thrill kill move, if you're not that person, you're fucked, because the meter does go down, but it goes down really, really slowly. And the arena is way too small to have dodging them be a viable option. The best you can kind of hope for is that there are other opponents that will get killed instead of you, which does make it tough when you're getting into those later rounds. But overall, I had a decent time with it.
Now, what was your personal take on its raciness or goriness, compared to other things? Were you shocked, like, oh yeah, I can see that this was far and beyond other things at the time, or like, does it not quite live up to its reputation in that regard?
I mean, the tough part of that is I need to think about this not from 2022 eyes, but from 1998 eyes. And probably 1998 Kevin would be shocked by this, or maybe he wouldn't, because he had played a shit ton of Primal Rage before that, which was probably more violent than this game is. For all their hype about all these fatalities, a lot of them just boil down to, okay, punch the guy, all of his limbs come off, punch him, his head comes off. And like I said, I did a side-by-side comparison between this and Mortal Kombat 4, which the arcade version of Mortal Kombat 4 came out in 97, so a year before it. I think that game was more violent. The raciness, I probably would have felt uncomfortable when I was in 1998 playing it, but then again, I was 14, so I would probably also been the right audience for that. I didn't feel terribly scandalized playing it. I think they could have gotten away with it. But again, that's me looking back at it. Let's fast forward to the end of our story. Over the next several years, Paradox Development carved a niche developing fighting games based on licensed brands for several major publishers. Between 2000 and 2004, they released a fighting game based on Rock'em Sock'em Robots for Mattel, 2 X-Men fighting games, X-Men Mutant Academy 1 and 2 for Activision, and a pair of backyard wrestling games, Backyard Wrestling Don't Try This at Home, and Backyard Wrestling There Goes the Neighborhood for Eidos. They also entered a deal with Midway to develop a 3D beat-em-up based on Mortal Kombat, which is the dope as hell Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks, which I highly recommend. That is a legitimately fun game. While working on Shaolin Monks, on November the 30th, 2004, Midway acquired Paradox Development, renaming the company Midway Studios Los Angeles. However, in the ensuing years, Midway fell on hard times and closed Midway Studios Los Angeles on September the 30th, 2008. When they closed Midway Los Angeles, the company moved a bunch of the former Paradox team to Midway San Diego, and then THQ bought the company less than a year later, renaming it THQ San Diego, which THQ then later shut down in 2012. One person who wasn't around for Paradox's ultimate demise was Christine Shu, who left Midway Studios Los Angeles in 2006 to form a new company called BizHub Inc., followed by another small game studio called Quirky Games Inc. They haven't done very much. Their most recent title was Tales of the Shire, spelled S-H-Y-R-E, not to be confused or sued by the estate of Jared Tolkien for S-H-I-R-E, which they released for the PC in 2015. And that is the end of our story of Thrill Kill. Final thoughts?
Interesting story. Thrill Kill started as an attempt to get into the fighting game industry. And then it was kind of pushed to become a very on the edge, hyper-violent, hyper-sexualized game. And then due to mergers, acquisitions, suddenly it was just canceled. Yet it sounds like the studio and the developers were able to continue making games and were able to come up with a couple of decent ones. It's kind of a nice story with a happy ending.
So, Kevin, at one point during this play-by-play, the game studio's making this game, somebody comes in and says, we have to put in a BSDM angle on this. And then that persisted throughout the life cycle of this game being developed. But then ultimately, the game was really killed because it just wasn't going to be able to compete with the other games it would have to when it was released. So my question is, if it hadn't been given that angle, do you think that would have mattered? Or no matter what, if it had just been a straight up fighting game, like mainstream like the others, would it have been competitive?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I think this was a really crowded market at that time. Tons of companies were making 3D fighters, and there were a couple that stuck around, like Tekken, like Virtua Fighter, but there were tons of games that didn't make it. I would have seen this game without the BDSM angle. I think they would have faded away with like Mace the Dark Age and like War Gods and Biofreaks and a bunch of other ones that were made at that time for a variety of different companies trying to capitalize on this trend and not really going very far. And with the BDSM thing, I think that they would have had obviously attention, which is what they wanted. And considering Virgin was not in a great financial state, they wanted to probably get attention however they could get it. And go back to our episode in the Turok naming contest for an example of another company that was in similarly dire straits, which was looking for any way to get mainstream attention. But then again, of course, what ended up happening with that is it kind of, I'm not going to say worked too well, but it got enough attention that it basically hampered any potential sales it would have gotten, both from the AO rating and then getting on the attention VA, which is completely tanked it. But yeah, without the theme that they put in, they probably weren't going to go very far. And with the theme, they also ended up not going very far.
They flew too close to the sun.
I mean, I guess my question there is, like Alfred just said, they still move on to do other successful things. And is that based on the notoriety of the BSDM angle, or was it because they were competent game developers who already had this experience and this framework from another game?
I think it's a little bit of both, actually. I'm going to put in the description a link to that article that I kept citing from Variety by Stephen Wright, where he talked to a bunch of former Paradox development people. And some of it was that they were able to use their experience and leverage it into this other stuff. And a bunch of the guys ended up working for a long time. I know one of them ended up working for Neversoft and worked on Tony Hawk and things like that. And a bunch of them stayed in the industry and worked in a lot of prominent places. But one of them commented, and I forgot which one, I'll look at. One of them commented that, like, from a career standpoint, for a lot of them, it kind of worked out that Thrill Kill didn't get released because a bunch of them acknowledged looking back. And again, this article was from 3 years ago. So looking back, this game was really cringy and uncomfortable and probably wouldn't hold up very well. But they got a lot of jobs on the basis of, wow, this is a wild story about this game that, can you imagine the studio made us try to do this BDSM themed game? And so some of it is like this weird, interesting story that they were able to tell people. But on top of that, they also were able to get a lot of experience in the fighting game scene and carve a niche. Now, a lot of those ended up being licensed games that, like with a lot of licensed games, kind of came and went, and people would have saw them as probably mostly like cash grabs. And a lot of them were, I haven't looked into the sales figures of some of those games, were at least probably modest successes, but didn't have a huge amount of staying power. So it's kind of a little bit of both. It was both the notoriety of working on this game and also the actual practical experience they got from working on this game.
So this really, I mean, in my view, kind of one of the first scandals we've talked about on this podcast where all of the decisions made were kind of defensible.
Yeah. It's weird how, as much as it is linked, like scandalous edge they were writing with the cancellation, it's weird that kind of the precipitating factor was actually just getting caught up in acquisitions, which is the reason so many less scandalous games wind up getting canceled, regardless of what state of development they're in. It's just, well, a new studio owns our company now, and they want us to work on this other thing instead, or they just don't want to pay any of us to work here anymore. And so the whole thing is getting scrapped, regardless of what the game was about. So it was kind of a real twist there at the end.
Yeah, isn't that something? You hear about these things where like certain bosses are really, really into this one thing, and then those bosses are out of the picture, and the new bosses come in and they don't really care about it that much. And some of that sounds like with EA. It's like this wasn't their baby. They were not desperate to have this game out there the way that Virgin sounds like they were. What I found most surprising about researching this was that you think it's going to be mostly about this weird sex and violence angle, but ultimately it ends up being a story about, in some ways, about just business. It's just the games industry working this way. And that kind of segues into my final point, which is I find this a fascinating case study considering all the stuff we've talked about with Running with Scissors. I know we keep referring back to them, but like Paradox development is kind of like the alternate universe version of Running with Scissors. Because like think about it. So Running with Scissors formed in 1996 as original programming division for this company called Riddell Software Productions. And RSP did the stuff that Paradox was doing. They were work for hire. They were brought in by publishers who had a license that they wanted to make, and they had direction for a game, and they came in and they did that. And then they moved on to the next job. And that's how they worked throughout the 80s and the early 1990s. That's pretty much what Paradox is doing. And a lot of small game studios work that way. This is the job for a lot of these studios. You contract with Namco or EA or Activision or whoever, and then you move on to the next job. And mostly what you hope is that you'll get acquired by one of these companies and be like a regular part of it, or maybe get some big license to be able to do original IP. I think of people like Iguana. Iguana is a good example because Iguana was acquired by Acclaim. They had done a lot of licensed stuff before that. And then they were able to make Turok, and that was their game for a while. And they had able to have their own original property. Now, eventually they folded because of claim, because the other trade-off of working with the big publishing systems, if they fail, you're going to fail too. And that is the interesting thing with Running with Scissors and Paradox kind of diverge, is that, Paradox played the game, as it were. They worked with the big studios. They made a pretty sizable library of games, none of them being superstar hits, but they're steadily making games. And meanwhile, Running with Scissors, since 1997, has made 3 games, all of them Postal, with the one coming out in 97, the other coming out in 2003, and then Postal 4 coming out in 2022. So being able to have long gaps where you did not have to work and presumably still had money and did not have to work with publishers. So it's kind of funny seeing you have one company that had a controversial game and just ended up just working as a business, and then whatever's going on at Running with Scissors. But I guess the other way of looking at it is the joke's on them, because Paradox Development played the game like it seemed like you were supposed to, and got bought up by Midway and then swept up in Midway's business and then THQ's business, and they're not around anymore. Meanwhile, Running with Scissors has somehow endured for over a quarter century. But I find that it is an interesting parallel of these two, where like there's another universe where the guys like Vince Desi's got to kind of like his act together and acts like an actual professional, and this is what happened. So I just find that fascinating, and it's a weird story, this whole thing. All right, I guess that's a good place to end on. So that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating on iTunes. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seek Me by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NCSA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizeri.
I'm Phil Thomas.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Elford Stephens.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube.